It started with a sound, the crack of concrete splitting open beneath a demolition hammer. But what rose from beneath that floor in Queens wasn't just old metal or broken stone, it was history screaming to be heard. In 2004, a construction crew working on an abandoned parking garage hit something strange, a layer of concrete far thicker than the blueprint said. When the machine's hydraulic arm struck metal, the sound that followed made the foreman kill the engine. Because it didn't sound like rebar, it sounded hollow. Within minutes, the air turned cold. Dust filled the underground space, and as the crew cleared the debris, the truth began to emerge, row after row of massive rusted barrels. Industrial, 55 gallons each, sealed shut with age. Some split open from corrosion, and inside one of them was a human skull. That moment would unravel one of the darkest mysteries New York had ever buried: the disappearance of 30 construction workers in 1939. Detective Kalin Paxton was in the middle of an interrogation when it all began. He was close moments away from breaking a suspect who'd been lying for hours. The air in the NYPD interrogation room was thick with tension, the smell of burnt coffee and fear hanging heavy. Then the door opened. "Detective Paxton, you're being pulled. Now." Captain Daria Wallace never interrupted without reason. "A situation in Queens," she said. "Old garage. They hit something under the foundation." Paxton frowned. "Toxic waste?" Wallace hesitated. "They're not sure, but it's homicide's jurisdiction. Your primary." The drive across the city was slow, the kind of crawl that gives your mind too much time to think. When Kalin arrived, the site looked like a tomb, a gray concrete relic of another time, now surrounded by floodlights and uniforms. The air smelled of dust, old oil, and something else, something that didn't belong to the living. At the lowest level, the foreman led him to the crater in the floor. The hammer had split open a slab of concrete almost 2 feet thick, exposing the dark earth below. And there they were, those barrels. Dozens of them. All identical, all marked by a faded blue band around the middle. The smell leaking from the ruptured one made Kalin's stomach turn. It wasn't chemical. It was human. He crouched down, shining his flashlight into the crack. The beam caught something pale, curved, smooth, bone, a skull. The hollow sockets stared back at him through layers of decay and rust, as if the dead themselves had been waiting for someone to finally look down long enough to find them. Within hours, the entire garage had transformed into a full-scale crime scene. Floodlights buzzed overhead. Forensic teams moved carefully, their faces pale beneath masks. Barrel by barrel, they were pulled from the earth, each one more corroded, more horrifying than the last. 5 barrels, then 10, then 20. By dawn, there were 30. 30 barrels, 30 bodies, each sealed and buried beneath the feet of a city that had forgotten them. The medical examiner, Dr. Lena Hansen, surveyed the grim lineup. "These barrels are fragile," she said. "Extraction's going to take time." Kalin nodded, his mind racing. The concrete had preserved them, like fossils. But this wasn't nature's doing. This was deliberate, cold, calculated. When the last barrel was unearthed, the team stood in silence. It wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was a mass grave. Later that night, Kalin walked through the site alone. The buzz of the generators had faded. The silence pressed down on him. Why 30 men? Why hide them here, and who had gone to such lengths to erase them? He didn't have answers yet, but he had a lead: the time. 1,939. He sent a team to pull the original building permits. When they returned, the date on the foundation slab hit him like a punch. October 1939, the same month, 30 construction workers had mysteriously vanished from a remote worksite upstate, a case so old it had turned into a ghost story. For 65 years, their families were told the same thing. They walked away, victims of the Great Depression. Another group of men who just disappeared when hope ran out, but now, standing among 30 rusted barrels, Kalin Paxton knew the truth. They hadn't walked away. They'd been buried alive by history, by corruption, and by something far more powerful than time. When the first identification came in, it broke everything open. Dental records matched one of the victims to Silas Griffin, a construction foreman who had disappeared that same fall in 1939. Griffin's name wasn't alone on that report. It was part of a list. 30 men all vanished the same, weak, all working for the same company. Kalin froze when he saw the project name Adirondack Summit Development, and then one name among the missing made his blood run cold. Bernard Paxton, his grandfather. That's when the case stopped being just another mystery and became personal. Kalin stared at the name on the report as if his world had tilted. Bernard Paxton, his grandfather, the man whose disappearance had haunted his family for generations, now identified among 30 murdered men buried beneath a parking garage. For years, Kalin's father had whispered stories about Bernard. He was a good man. He didn't just vanish. Now, standing under the cold glow of floodlights, Kalin realized his family's ghost story was never about loss. It was about murder. The next day, Kalin drove to Brooklyn to deliver the news to the Griffin family, the descendants of Silas Griffin, the first identified victim. Inside a small, time-worn house, 3 generations gathered as he told them what had been found. The oldest, Otis Griffin, sat silent in his recliner, his hands trembling. When Kalin said his father's name, the old man's eyes filled with tears. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. 65 years of not knowing ended right there in one unbearable moment. But Otis's son, Vaughn Griffin, wasn't silent. His voice cracked with rage. Buried? After all this time? You found him buried under a parking garage? Kalin nodded. Along with the others, we believe they were murdered. Vaughn's jaw tightened. By who? Kalin hesitated. We don't know yet, but we will. And then he said it, the truth he couldn't keep in any longer. My grandfather was one of them too. The room went still. 2 families, 2 legacies, one shared wound reopened after 6 decades. Otis motioned toward a small wooden box on the shelf. Vaughn brought it down and opened it with shaking hands. Inside lay old letters, a rusted pocket knife, and a black and white photo. 30 men stood under the steel skeleton of a half-built lodge, their faces hard and unsmiling. That's them, Otis whispered. Kalin's eyes scanned the photo until he found his grandfather standing tall in the second row beside Silas Griffin. 2 men who had no idea their final project would become their grave. He left the Griffin home that night with a copy of the photograph, a piece of history he couldn't let go. He pinned it above his desk, 30 pairs of eyes staring down at him like silent witnesses. Days turned into sleepless nights. Kalin dug into the archives, combing through brittle documents, yellowed permits, and forgotten police notes. The original 1,939 investigation had been a joke, vague, rushed, intentionally buried. The company behind the lodge project, Adirondack Summit Development, was owned by a powerful family, the Mercers. Even during the Depression, they were untouchable, a dynasty built on construction, politics, and money. And buried deep in an old detective's notes, Kalin found a single line that chilled him to the bone. Suspected organized activity, forced labor, obstruction from ASD executives. That was it. No follow-up, no arrests. Just silence. The kind of silence money buys. The more Kalin read, the clearer it became. The 30 workers must have seen something they weren't supposed to, something the Mercers couldn't risk getting out. While Kalin fought bureaucracy and buried truth, Vaughn Griffin refused to wait. He packed his car and drove north to the Adirondack Mountains, the last place their grandfathers had been alive. The lodge still stood, a historic landmark wrapped in pine and mist. Beautiful, peaceful, and wrong. Vaughn felt it in his bones. He hiked miles into the forest, tracing the coordinates from the old maps. The wilderness had reclaimed the workers' camp, moss-covered foundations, rusted tools, fragments of forgotten lives. But just before dusk, he found something that didn't belong. Half buried in a hillside was a stone structure, too solid to be a shack, too hidden to be part of the lodge. Vaughn forced his way inside through a narrow gap in the collapsed doorway. His flashlight cut through the dark, revealing rusted metal rings bolted into the walls. Restraints. His breath caught. This wasn't storage. It was a cell. He raised his camera and began snapping photos, the flash slicing through the gloom. The air was thick with mold and the faint smell of something old, something human. The rumors were true. The men hadn't vanished. They'd been prisoners, and when they tried to speak, someone made sure they never would again. Vaughn stumbled out into the fading light, his heart pounding. He needed to tell Kalin to show him the proof that their grandfathers hadn't just died. They'd been silenced. Back in the city, Kalin was piecing together another kind of puzzle. Forensic analysis traced the barrels to a 1,939 order placed with a company called Tri-State Hauling, a transport firm contracted by none other than Adirondack Summit Development. Tri-State Hauling didn't vanish, it evolved. Today, it had a new name, TSH Logistics, a multi-million-dollar corporation still run by the Mercer family. The realization hit Kalin like ice water. The people who murdered his grandfather were still alive, still powerful, still hiding behind skyscrapers and boardrooms. He brought his findings to Captain Wallace, expecting outrage. Instead, she looked terrified. "Detective," she said quietly, "you're treading on dangerous ground. The Mercer Group has influence everywhere, even here. You'll need more than old files to touch them." Kalin saw it, then the same pattern of fear that had silenced the 1,939 detective. The cover-up wasn't ancient history. It was alive, and it was still protecting the same family. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Vaughn couldn't sleep after what he'd found in the mountains. He returned to the city, restless and burning for answers. If the Mercers were still operating, then the nightmare his grandfather died trying to expose might still be happening. He began watching the Mercer-owned logistics hub a sprawling complex on the edge of the East River. For nights, he saw nothing but trucks, steel containers, and silence, until one night, everything changed. Extra guards, closed gates, a van pulling up beside a sealed truck. Through his camera's lens, Vaughn saw movement shadows of people being forced from the van into the truck. Not workers, prisoners. His hands shook. The camera flashed once. A guard looked up, then another. "Hey, you! Stop!" Vaughn ran. Tires screeched. Engines roared. A black SUV burst from the gate, chasing him through the industrial maze. He barely made it out alive, bloodied, breathless, but clutching his camera. He went straight to Kalin's apartment, pounding on the door. "They're still doing it!" Vaughn gasped. "Human trafficking right now!" The Mercers never stopped. Kalin's face went pale. Everything fit the forced labor, the mass murder, the cover-up. What began in 1939 hadn't ended. It had evolved. He promised Vaughn they'd stop it, but deep down, he knew taking down the Mercers meant going to war with the most powerful family in New York. And wars like that always have casualties.